This is a presentation on negative reinforcement. Revision number 1, because we are constantly learning. I really need to thank Dr. Susan Friedman for her infinite generosity in helping me to rethink some of the aspects of this presentation in its first revision. Thank you so much. She also helped a lot with just the wording of what I'm trying to describe. So this presentation is not about choke collars, shock collars, prong collars, or shock mats, ear pinching, or use of pain in training. These are not things I endorse. But I am all for stop buttons, making sure that an animal can retreat to a safe spot should he feel the need to, and giving control back to animals. And that's what we'll be looking at in this presentation. What is negative reinforcement in all its shapes and sizes? Because all too often, people have a very narrow view of what it is. So in this presentation, we will define what negative reinforcement is, see why it's not inherently bad, look at a lot of examples of negative reinforcement, because I find that when I'm taught something new, I need more than one example to be able to well understand it, and afterwards generalize and be able to see it when it happens in other contexts. And then we'll try to define what is an acceptable use of negative reinforcement and what isn't. Before we start, I should mention that this presentation has been fueled by other people's great insights, many of whom I'm sure I've now forgotten, but I will at least give you the following examples. Karen Pryor's book, Don't Shoot the Dog, from 1984, although I have the 1999 version, has an example in it about fearful llamas that was the very starting point in my journey of understanding negative reinforcement better. Dr. Susan Friedman has actually been talking about this for a long time, although you might not have noticed it. I always learn something new when I re-listen to her older talks. You might want to go read her article titled Pavlov's Parrots from 2007, her more recent article titled Why Animals Need Trainers Who Adhere to the Least Intrusive Principle, Improving Animal Welfare and Owning Trainers' Skills, is all about the subject of negative reinforcement, and she presented on it at the 2021 Lemonade Conference. Katie's Deo wrote a blog post a while back called What Not to Pair, The Consequence of Mixing Consequences. That is also very interesting, so I encourage you to go read these after watching this. So let's get into it. What is negative reinforcement? We have the reinforcement part. That means that what's happening in the environment is making it more likely that the behavior will be repeated in the future in a similar context. So it means that this behavior works. It gets the animal what the animal was looking to achieve by its behavior. It gives the animal control over its outcomes. Reinforcement encourages behavior by making it effective. If behavior is not effective, it won't be encouraged. It won't repeat in the future. It will extinguish. At the opposite, punishment discourages behavior, so it doesn't let the animal know what behavior would make it successful in the goal it's aiming for. Reinforcement gives the animal the power to affect what's happening to them. If it works, it will be repeated. If behavior gives you what you want, you will use it again. That's what reinforcement is about. We then have the negative part. That means that as a consequence for the behavior, something is subtracted from the situation. So you can think of positive reinforcement as additive reinforcement, and of negative reinforcement as subtractive reinforcement. Now, for a behavior to be encouraged by the removal of something, that something needs to be unaversive. Otherwise, its removal wouldn't encourage the behavior. If a behavior has for consequence that you lose an appetitive, that behavior will be discouraged in the future, not encouraged. So in negative reinforcement, your behavior has for consequence to make something disappear, move away, or stop. So then we have that aversive part. An aversive is something we would rather avoid happening or arriving. You can generally think of appetitives as things you're running towards, and of aversives as things you're running away from, but that doesn't necessarily cover all of them. One very important thing to realize is that both appetitives and aversives come in a wide range of intensities that are constantly changing. For example, a piece of chicken doesn't have the same value as a piece of carrot for a given individual. But that piece of chicken also doesn't always have the same value for that individual. Hunger changes that value. Lack of variety in the diet changes that value. Fear changes that value. So chicken doesn't have a fixed intensity for a given individual. The same is true with aversives. So I think the big mistake people make is to think that aversives are always of high magnitude. In training in general, the emotion related to aversives is often fear, but fear is not always of high intensity. You can be terrified, scared, worried, on the lookout for, uncomfortable, or uneasy. All these are not of the same intensity. The emotion might also not be fear. So you would much rather avoid your spouse having to go work up north for 6 months. You will be sad. You would much rather avoid the waiter at the restaurant taking your plate away before you're finished. You will be angry. You would much rather avoid being in a situation where you don't understand what you need to do. You will be confused. All these emotions are uncomfortable ones. We would rather avoid all of these situations. They are aversive. In training, often we deal with fear, which is what I'll concentrate on, but we could just use the more encompassing category of uncomfortable emotions to think about aversives. So let's look at a couple of examples where aversives have a variety of intensities. If you're afraid of clowns and one suddenly comes up to you from behind, you will startle, jump back, and yell. You're scared. If the clown is at the other end of the park while you're having a picnic, you will be uneasy and you'll keep an eye out for it just to make sure it doesn't come your way. Same aversive, but differing intensities based on distance. If there's a person you don't like at a barbecue in your friend's or your family's yard, as long as you're in their yard with loads of people, you might only be slightly uneasy. If you end up in the house alone with them while going to the bathroom, you might get a lot more uncomfortable or even worried. The presence or absence of others, along with the open versus the enclosed space, changes the aversive's value. Personally, you're not scared of tangerines, but that cat is. Two different individuals will not see the same thing as being aversive. This cat won't climb the sofa or the Christmas tree because there are tangerines on or around it. So that animal is forced to live in a restricted area, a home, where there are little tarantulas in transparent boxes everywhere. The human doesn't see it as a problem, but for the cat, it's a really big problem. Then we get urinary illness in the cat and we wonder why. Well, it's because we added relatively high intensity aversives everywhere in their enclosure. Let's say that you are standing in line at the store waiting to pay for your items, and the person in front of you in the line is a bit weird, talking to themselves, or clearly intoxicated while screaming, or just cursing to themselves at the incompetence of the employees. All of these are aversives. We would rather avoid all of these people. The person cursing, at the very least, makes us uncomfortable. Our stress level goes up as we wait in line. But all these aversive people do not have the same intensity, and because of that, we sometimes don't recognize them for what they are. Telling the person who's cursing that, the staff are all doing their best, please be polite, could have two consequences. So the person might shut up, in which case you're more likely to use that same tactic again in the next time this happens. So negative reinforcement, your behavior made the aversive stop. Or they might start to transfer their anger onto you, get into a conversation about how wrong you are and how right they are, in which case you will likely not use that tactic again in the future under similar circumstances because it did not get you what you wanted. If negative reinforcement is in effect, your behavior allows you to escape the cursing. You have gained a way to control the aversive. If negative reinforcement is not in effect, your behavior does not allow you to escape the aversive and is therefore not going to be repeated in the future. You will change your tactics and maybe try to yell at them or try to put their behavior on extinction by not reacting at all. So because people tend to think of aversives as being only of high intensity, they sometimes don't see them when they're right in front of them. If I ask you to help me move to my new apartment by promising pizza, that's positive reinforcement. You help me move and I provide good food and hopefully good company. That won't trigger the same emotional response in you than if I ask you to help me move by threatening to tarnish your reputation on social media if you don't. That's negative reinforcement. You're going to help me move in order to avoid me giving you a bad reputation. Now, what if I ask you to help me move by promising to help you move when you soon need to? You might actually currently be worried that you won't have anyone to help you move on that day. And now you've escaped that worry by helping me move. That's a relatively low intensity of aversive and negative reinforcement that wasn't applied or imposed by the person who allows you to escape the worry. Wouldn't you want that type of negative reinforcement to be in effect? Or would you just rather feel helpless at finding friends to help you move? So negative reinforcement happens when your behavior allows you to escape or avoid something you would rather escape or avoid. The consequence of the aversive being subtracted from the situation is what you are looking to get from your behavior. And it has worked! Woo! Relief. And now I know that I have a behavior I can do in the future that will allow me to control what happens to me in this situation. What am I trying to make you realize? Well, if negative reinforcement wasn't in effect in our lives, it would mean that we would never be able to control our aversives, that whatever we did, we wouldn't be able to affect our outcomes. Not being able to influence your environment through your behavior leads to learned helplessness. And there will always be aversives in our lives. There are multiple aversives in your life every day of varying intensities. We do not live in a bubble or a fairy tale. Life throws things at us. Our behavior allows us to influence how those things will affect us. We are adaptable. We can't not have the aversives be there, but we can control them through our behavior. Of course, from a general quality of life and welfare perspective, we need to be mindful of making sure that our life and our animals' lives have a high amount of appetitives and positive reinforcement in them. As much as possible, we want life to have a minimal amount of aversives that we can control and a huge amount of appetitives that we can access. So it's not enough to just say that aversives need to be controllable, but I'm concentrating here on the subject of negative reinforcement. Now let's look at these two words a little more carefully, escape or avoid. Escape means that the aversive is applied, and then your behavior allows you to remove it. Avoid means that the threat of the aversive is present, and your behavior allows you to avoid even having it applied. The threat is then removed. So we can look at avoid as being related to a threat. It's a command, do it or else. Run when you hear the doorbell, because otherwise the scary strangers are going to appear and try to pet you. Let's think of your coat-wearing behavior. It allows you to avoid the cold. We wouldn't want to be outside in below freezing weather without it. The cold is high intensity, but your behavior of putting on your coat allows you to avoid it. It's noteworthy here to mention that no one is forcing you to go out. The aversive is already present in your life, but no one is presenting it as a threat. But it's still threatening enough to you to encourage your coat-wearing behavior. Putting on the coat empowers you to control how the cold affects you. You avoid it. Let's say that you're standing in line at the store again, waiting to pay for your items, and someone wants to pass by you because they're not buying anything and they just want to get out of the store. They come up from behind and gently touch your arm with light pressure. You take a step sideways and look at why someone did that as they're moving along. You escaped the pressure by moving sideways. It was, for most people, a very low intensity aversive. You're in a place with a lot of people moving about. You might get bumped or bump someone yourself accidentally, and it's no big deal. Feeling a slight pressure on your arm is not scary, it's barely annoying. Stepping sideways allows you to escape the slight pressure. If the person, instead of touching you, had said, "Move or I'll push you," how would that have made you feel? We've just gone into avoid mode instead of escape, and it's really not feeling good at all. Your heart rate just skyrocketed and you're on high alert because someone just threatened you out of the blue. Your behavior of moving sideways will allow you to avoid having the pressure applied, but it's way more scary than just having had the slight pressure applied to your arm in the first place. Would it have been nicer to just cue you, "Could you please move sideways a little," and then reinforce you with "thank you," so positive reinforcement? Yes, it would have, but that's not my point here. My point is that under a negative reinforcement contingency, there's a wide range in the intensity of the aversive, and the lower one might not be a problem at all for general welfare. When you dance with someone and follow their lead, you escape the tiny pressure. You still enjoy dancing. You will agree to dance because you gain pleasure from it, but in the moment you will lean out of the pressure to escape it. You're not running away from the dance floor or your partner before he even touches you. You just respond to the slight pressure. That also allows you to avoid getting stepped on your feet by your partner, which might hurt a lot and be a higher intensity aversive. But you don't fear your partner or the pressure, and that pressure quickly becomes a cue because you gain so much positive reinforcement in the form of balance and all sorts of sensory inputs as you move and spin for reacting to the cue. Okay, now that we've defined negative reinforcement and that maybe you're starting to see why it's not necessarily bad in itself, I'd like to take a little bit of time to look at why positive reinforcement is not always necessarily good, with some examples. If there's only one way to gain an appetitive, we're going towards the coercive side. In some circumstances, that can be very inappropriate. There's only one way you'll get that appetizing piece of chicken, and it's by coming all the way towards me to get it from my fingers, even though you're scared of me. That doesn't sound very nice, does it? Using an inappropriate positive reinforcer can be another problem. I'll give you access to that female if you do that behavior. Well, maybe that female doesn't want to be in the room with you. I'll give you this new drug that makes you feel high, but it has high risks of creating a dependency if you do this. Well, maybe that's not such a good idea for you. The female and the drug are not appropriate positive reinforcers, but they work, and positive reinforcement can be happening for that individual's behavior. I think we can agree that I could teach my cats to touch a running chainsaw through successive approximations with gradual desensitization and using food. But would that be ethical positive reinforcement? We can cause accidental frustration and discomfort in animals by having bad training mechanics, a poor training plan, or just not expecting the behavior they give us in the moment and being puzzled as to how to proceed next. A stressed learner that doesn't understand what he's supposed to do is not what we meant to create when we set out to use positive reinforcement in training, but it does happen. I've certainly been guilty of it. As we become better trainers, we learn to better set up our animals for success, but we can't pretend that everything is always perfect in our training. Think of how frustrating and unsettling it is when you're at the store and you can't figure out how the new payment terminal works for your credit card. You're confused. That's aversive to us. We would all rather avoid being confused, and so do our animals. Extreme deprivation. So don't feed the dog for 48 hours before the consult, but I'm a positive reinforcement trainer. If I hadn't eaten for 48 hours, that piece of chicken would not be a positive reinforcer. It would be a negative one. Think about it. The state of deprivation that has been created first is so intense, so high in intensity, that I feel weak, sick, and I'm just looking for anything that would allow me to escape the hunger. The aversive state was first applied. I'm looking to escape it. I'll eat ants if that allows me to do that. So some trainers pretend that we're in a positive reinforcement realm here, but we're really not anymore. People leave out bread for birds, so the bird's behavior of showing up is positively reinforced with bread. But bread is bad for birds. It's not nutritious and it makes them feel full. So it's a bad use of positive reinforcement from a welfare perspective for the birds. And the last one, so delivering positive reinforcement for unwanted behavior and then complaining about it. How many people accidentally reinforce their animal for behavior that annoys them? The cat is meowing at night. Okay, what did you do? Well, I got up, petted him, and fed him. The meowing behavior has been hugely positively reinforced. It now has a huge reinforcement history, and now we blame the cat. Positive reinforcement was implemented by the human with terrible consequences for the relationship of the person and the animal. It doesn't matter that no one planned for it. The cat still got trained. Positive reinforcement was still in effect. The same happens with negative reinforcement. It's often there even if no one planned it or wanted it. Okay, time for a couple of great quotes from great people that you might want to think over. Dr. Eduardo Fernandez said in one of his online recordings, by saying that a timeout and therefore negative punishment is involved, doesn't suddenly make it unethical. That's a terrible way to guide our ethics if we are going to say that we care more about the term that is used to describe some procedure than what is actually happening. Ken Ramirez said at Clicker Expo in 2019, where I think deprivation gets us in trouble is the same place aversive tools get us in trouble. It's not that the tool itself is bad, it's just that as humans, when we use a tool, we tend to take it to extremes. In the words of Dr. Laura Hogg at the Lemonade Conference in 2020, negative reinforcement is like gravity. So in other words, it means that negative reinforcement happens whether you like it or not. To sum up these quotes, I really hope we can start asking what a person is doing instead of labeling it, and because of that label, deciding that it's necessarily bad. And negative reinforcement happens whether we want it or not. It's there whether you like it or not. If you say it's not really raining outside and I go look out the window and it's clearly pouring outside, you're not making sense. When we deal with fearful animals, removing our hand, moving away, turning away are all things that are very likely to reinforce whatever behavior is happening in the moment, regardless of whether we planned for it or not. Because this is what the animal was looking to get through its behavior. The function of its behavior is to increase the distance between us. At one of the shelters where I volunteered, there was a fearful cat that would hiss at anyone going towards its cage. So in the beginning, he would be crouching at the back of the cage with big eyes, dilated pupils, and he would hiss with a lot of intensity. Sheesh! After many months, he would be sitting erect, relaxed, in the middle of the cage, and would hiss with a much less convincing manner. Sheesh. Why? Well, every day, multiple adopters and volunteers would go towards his cage. He would hiss at them. They would go away. It worked for him. Negative reinforcement, his behavior had effect. Every single person in that shelter negatively reinforced his behavior, even though no one had planned for it. He learned that he had some control. He could make the scary people go away. And gradually, without knowing it, they all shaped him through negative reinforcement to hiss a little softer, with calmer eyes, while standing, anywhere in the cage. He would just go shish and they would leave. Why expend more energy when less expensive behaviors get you the same outcome? When you have control over scary people, they're also a lot less scary. So negative reinforcement happened. It didn't matter that no one knew about it. And it was a good thing that it happened in the sense that that cat was a lot less stressed. Could his perception of people have been changed more efficiently? Sure. My point is that if negative reinforcement had not been in effect, that cat would have been in learned helplessness and would have suffered a lot more during those months, because it would have meant that his behavior had no effect. So the tool you use is not as important as how you use it. Again, it's not a good use of positive reinforcement when the cat ends up waking you in the middle of the night. How you use positive reinforcement is important, and how you use negative reinforcement is also important. We humans use words to describe the world around us. Let me give you another example of the fact that no human needs to be present for these words that define situations to be happening. So let's think of backchaining. Naturally, your mind might be going to a super canine freestyle routine and how better it can be to backchain a particular sequence of behaviors. Okay, there's clearly a human planning it in this example. What about the way kittens learn to hunt? They learn to first eat dead prey. Then their mother brings almost dead prey and they learn to kill it and eat it. Then their mother brings injured prey and they learn to catch it, kill it, and eat it. Then their mother brings prey in good condition and they learn to run after, catch, kill, and eat it. Then their mother brings them along for the hunt and they learn to crouch, wait, run, catch, kill, and eat. And finally, the kittens learn what are the best spots to wait for prey, and crouch, wait, run, catch, kill, and eat. Beautiful example of backchaining. The sequence isn't dropped on the kittens, the mom splits it into manageable chunks, and the kittens learn. Just because we humans put a name to it doesn't mean that a human needs to be present for it to occur. Okay, now for some more examples of negative reinforcement that help us understand why it's important that negative reinforcement be in effect in our lives. So you might have a coworker that always makes you uncomfortable at lunchtime, trying to have conversations you'd rather avoid, and giving you stomach upset. You might try eating your lunch in your cubicle rather than in the cafeteria, and that allows you to avoid him. If that behavior does not have effect, you might decide to go out for lunch. If that behavior doesn't have effect because he always waits for you at the elevator, you might just decide to change jobs, and then that finally works. Pressing the mute button on the remote allows me to escape the loud sound of the TV. What do you do at a red light? You stop walking. Why? To avoid getting run over by a car. Your behavior of stopping allows you to avoid getting run over. Negative reinforcement. You would much rather avoid being run over. So would I. What if cars suddenly decided to roll everywhere, on sidewalks, in parks, in people's front yards? Then we would not be able to avoid getting run over. The spaces that are normally safe wouldn't be safe anymore. We want our behavior of walking on the sidewalk and stopping at red lights to have effect. We need it to be working. If stopping at a red light allows us to avoid cars, negative reinforcement has worked, and that's what we want. The dog growls, and we move away. Growling pays. It removes the aversive. And we really do want to continue to encourage that when it happens. Because if behavior, growling, doesn't work, another behavior will be attempted, and that one might do a lot more damage to us than growling, meaning the dog might bite. We want to use negative reinforcement in this context. It means that we listen to the animal and avoid injury. Of course, the goal should always be to not cause the growling in the first place, but when growling does happen, we need to recognize it for what it is, and to make sure that the desired consequence of growling is happening. The aversive moves away. The sun is out. You move under a tree. You escape the burning rays. Your behavior of moving to a shaded area is negatively reinforced. You'll do that again in the future. Shaping on a point of contact. So you put your hand on your horse's shoulder and press gently until they move their weight away from the hand, and then you click and treat. That's your first approximation towards a sidestep. The slight pressure was very slightly annoying to the horse, and he moved away to escape it, negative reinforcement, and got clicked and treated for it immediately, positive reinforcement. Before long, you don't need to use the slight pressure. Your dog uses their stop button. For example, they remove their head from their chin rest position, so you stop the nail trim. Their behavior has effect. It made the thing that was starting to be worrisome stop. You'll try to adjust your training so that the dog doesn't feel the need to use their stop button, but in the moment, it's super important to listen to it. Constructional aggression treatment, CAT, or fearful to friendly, F2F, is a protocol for aggressive or fearful behavior that reinforces a wide range of calmer behaviors by removing the aversive when any of them are exhibited. So any one of those 1,000 behaviors gets the scary thing to move away. It's done with the aversive at the lowest intensity possible and gives the power to the animal to make the scary thing leave, quickly making the scary thing lose its aversiveness because it can now be controlled, and the behaviors that are reinforced are also calmer ones. Those behaviors are also really simple ones that the animal already has in his repertoire, such as blinking, shifting their gaze, turning their head, etc. I get the feeling that people sometimes think that sitting is an appropriate behavior to ask for when an animal is afraid of something, but I don't think it is. By reinforcing much smaller and varied behaviors, we get to where we want to go a lot more quickly. If sitting happens, sure, you should reinforce it, but don't make it the only behavior that gets the scary thing to move away. When you work with fearful animals, give them the control to make the scary thing leave. It's the goal of their behavior. Through their behavior, they are telling you that it's a very important reinforcer for them right now. Pressure of a leash as information to move. So ideally, a leash should be a safety tool, not necessarily a tool for walking. But just like shaping on the point of contact, slight tension being created on the leash can be a low-intensity aversive, a small annoyance, that can be relieved by just shifting their weight, moving in the opposite direction. It can then become a cue by adding positive reinforcement. If someone is walking behind you and you're afraid that they may be following you, stop and let them pass so that they're now in front of you. You're now not as worried because you can see what they're doing and where they're going. Your behavior allows you to control your aversive. Getting zoo animals to shift when they aren't trained to do so, to go into an enclosure and they need to for safety because of bad weather coming in or construction operations or that sort of thing. It's another example. Slowly moving towards them while they are between us and the enclosure might not be a terrible thing. Of course, it would much rather be better if they went running towards appetitives instead of walking away from us, aversives. But occasionally, and if implemented at low intensity, with no animal freaking out or freezing, this might not be detrimental to the overall welfare of the animals. And if we end up having to use it because we haven't planned for it, maybe we don't need to feel terrible. 2 years ago, I badly damaged my hip and I lost my escape potential for a time if someone were to attack me on the street. Now that doesn't happen much here, but it's still something I have in the back of my mind, particularly as a woman, and realizing that I couldn't run should something happen was very scary. I had no control. I didn't have behavior that would allow me to control my outcomes. I suddenly felt a lot of empathy for elderly people and those with mobility issues. When working with a fearful animal, throwing treats so that the animal moves away from you to get them gives both negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. So take a step towards me and I'll throw the treat behind you so that you get both the treat and the added distance from me. That's a lot more humane than just slurring the animal towards you with the food. Even if the interaction is interesting to the animal, it's still a relief for them to get a little more distance. If you go on a first date and it's going great, you're still gonna go, whew, when the other person gets up to go to the bathroom for 5 minutes. A little break when we are in unsure circumstances is often a very good thing. Throwing the treat away gives the animal that same break. A friend of mine who's not a dog trainer told me the other day about what she did when she realized that her newly adopted dog seemed stressed after having entered the pet store. She got out! How about that? And then she came back during calm hours and went into the lobby and then got out. Just inside, and got out. A little further in, and got out. Every time, her dog seemed more and more relaxed and more interested in exploring the pet store. His behavior had effect. If he felt the need to get out of the store, he knew it would work. And this dog was on allergy trials and didn't have treats that she could easily work with. But that didn't matter because what really mattered to that dog was knowing that he had the ability to escape should he feel the need to. He just needed to test it. Once he had control over that, a whole new bunch of appetitives in the pet store became available to him, things that had no value whatsoever the first time he went in because of fear. There are people playing in a park. Two of them are trying to catch the same ball. But one of them is in front of the other and is backing up. The person that's behind the other is going to try to avoid getting run into by moving sideways. If that doesn't work, they might escalate and put their hands on the person or even push them. Then their behavior has effect. It enables them to escape the aversive. Going back to a safe place, so whether it's the porch while training a fearful dog on the sidewalk, the car while training at the park, the cat's sanctuary room when he starts to explore the house, a crate at an event, a bathroom during a storm, etc. These are all negative reinforcement opportunities. My behavior allows me to distance myself from the stressful situation and go back to a safer spot. This is a foster cat I had in my home. She's meeting the stranger on the right. She will approach and retreat multiple times before engaging with the toy. She's giving herself the distance she needs to feel better. Will my behavior allow me to escape? Yes, it does. Okay, I'm not as worried then. Instead of choosing a cat stroller, I chose a wagon because it allows me to create a hideout that my cats can retreat to if they feel the need to. Putting on headphones allows me to avoid having to interact in public transport with people. We would all rather avoid having a full bladder in our civilized world where we can't go and pee anywhere at any time in public. That's a big aversive. We learn to look for a toilet before our bladder gets too full. I make sure that my cats have behaviors that allow them to escape the vacuum cleaner. In other words, I create negative reinforcement opportunities for my cats when I know that something scares them. That's all it took. They had control. They could start to observe the vacuum cleaner from afar and learn that they didn't need to fear it. Now they were okay with it. I didn't necessarily need to add food, but I did need to provide escape opportunities. Okay, now I want to talk a bit about the fact that when we mean to use a tool, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. I might mean to use positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, but if the behavior isn't increasing in the future under similar circumstances, it wasn't reinforcement. However, the important thing to realize here is that the similar circumstances are in the eye of the beholder. What I mean is that a situation might look the same to us from the outside, but for that animal, it might be very different. Although you might sometimes be able to perceive the change in the animal's body language, but not always. For example, if your cat currently goes into the carrier on cue, and you proceed to the next step of closing the door, but that makes him move towards it to get out, and so you open it back up immediately. What just happened? Well, the behavior of moving towards the door was reinforced by making the scary confinement go away. The door opened. That's negative reinforcement. The function of the behavior was the removal of the door. That was what was most important to that animal at that time. Now, on the next trial, the cat might just sit there when you close the door. From your viewpoint, nothing has changed. If the behavior had been reinforced, it would happen again. The cat should move forward when you close the door to make it open. But for the cat, a whole lot has changed. Should the cat feel the need to, he can make the door open. Control over the door abolishes that reinforcer's value. So the antecedents to the behavior are therefore not the same at all, in the sense that the value of the reinforcer has changed. That's motivating operations. The door opening is not a powerful negative reinforcer anymore because control was established over the door. So he might now be okay with you closing the door and just wait to be clicked and positively reinforced with food because food now has more value than escape. This is my cat Leia. We started to establish a start button, which is her looking at where my hand is going to come from. This is a cat that comes to be petted, but that isn't comfortable being touched outside of those instances. Here she will use her start button, but will back away at my hand, a sign that it isn't aversive. I therefore remove my hand. The second time she doesn't back up. Now you could argue that negative punishment discouraged the behavior of backing away because it made her lose the opportunity for food reinforcement. But she wouldn't have backed up initially if my hand wasn't at least a little bit aversive. She could avoid the hand or escape the touch if she tried. Her behavior had effect. It was negatively reinforced by the removal of my hand. So the value of the negative reinforcer therefore has dropped, and so the situation has changed. Now let me give you a human example that happened to me and that I did not see coming. It always helps you to understand what's really going on when you live through events such as this yourself. This is me. I go down holes regularly in the course of my job, but not many are as narrow as this one while being so deep. And let me say that the photos and videos don't do it justice. That thing was 3 floors deep. The first time I tried to go down, halfway, I stopped and looked for any excuse I had to go back up. I was getting anxious, breathing heavily, and starting to freak out. I went back up and breathed for 10 seconds, pretending nothing was wrong, and then I went back down. I was so calm on that second descent. I was incredibly calm, all the way to the point where I'd gone the first time. I was like a fish in water. The rest of the way I was a little more careful and made sure I was breathing, but it was easy overall. Why? My previous behavior had effect. I was able to escape the scary tube. I didn't plan this. I didn't tell myself, this is an example of negative reinforcement, just go back up. It was just as if my unconscious brain wasn't agreeing with the conscious part that told it everything will be okay, and it felt it had to test the escape potential. Once I went back up, my brain knew that my behavior had effect, that should I feel the need to, I could escape. That changed the value of the removal of the scary tube immensely. I didn't mind the scary tube as much. It wasn't as scary. I can control it. I could go down and do my job. I love negative reinforcement under these conditions. I want it to be present. I want to be able to do stuff in life, to gain experiences, to have control over what scares me. I'm not sorry at all for these experiences. Let's note here that no one forced me to go down, although there were strong incentives to do so, because if I didn't, I would have been doing my job, the problem with the pumping station would have been found and resolved, and I wouldn't have been paid. Hopefully, you now have a better perception of negative reinforcement in certain contexts. But as with everything in life, it's not worth much to have an opinion on whether something is acceptable or not if we can't define why and what clearly. So let's try to define in what situations negative reinforcement is acceptable and in what situations it isn't. And I'm sharing where I'm at in my journey to define this in this first revision of this presentation. And this might very well change, and you might not agree entirely. We constantly learn and hopefully become more caring trainers. This is, I hope, an opportunity to think about this for all of us. So what makes negative reinforcement okay versus not okay to use, in my opinion? There are 2 contexts in which I am either all for or okay with negative reinforcement being used. So the first context is when our goal is for the aversive we are using to lose its aversiveness through giving control to the animal of its proximity to that aversive, and by trying to be as low as possible in intensity. That's the one I'm all for. It's the equivalent of me going down the tube. Control and lowest possible intensity are important in distinguishing between negative reinforcement and flooding. In flooding, the learner has no control and the intensity is at its fullest. The goal of losing the aversiveness is important in distinguishing between training that adds an aversive to get behavior, for example, adding a near pinch to get the dog to drop the dumbbell, and training that incorporates an aversive that is already happening in the life of the animal, with the measure of our success being that that aversive isn't available for us to use anymore in this way, because it is not that aversive anymore. So the nail clippers, strangers, other dogs, the bat, the neighbors, etc. are all things that the animal will have to encounter in their daily life. A near pinch, a shock mac, or a prong collar are not things that the animal needs to encounter in their life. There is no real need for them. And when we use them, the goal is for them to keep being aversive. So the goal is to lose the aversiveness by giving control with as little intensity of aversive as possible. Now, we do have to address the fact that we can't always train in conditions that are ideal. So because of the small distance available to us in the environment we have to work in, the intensity of the aversive might be higher than we'd like. What I mean is that a shelter, a home, a barn, a zoo enclosure don't always allow us to have a lot of distance before the animal sees the aversive. If you've fostered the least socialized cats of your local shelter, you know what I'm talking about. These animals would need a football field distance to feel only attentive when we show up and not very fearful. We can't give them a football distance because, for one, we don't have rooms that big, but also because even if we did, we wouldn't be able to see them from that far away. But the fact that the intensity of the aversive is higher than we would like it to be is not a reason not to use a negative reinforcement protocol when that protocol will give the animal exactly what it's behaving to achieve, control. So there's no reason to leave an animal in a state of high stress for weeks if we can reassure him in one training session. When we don't have the ideal environment, the aversive might be higher in intensity than we'd hope, but the training session should quickly give the animal the control over the aversive that he needs, and the animal is therefore quickly a lot calmer. That then allows you to incorporate appetitives and positive reinforcement, because the animal is now in a state where these have value. By creating these negative reinforcement opportunities, we abolish the value of the negative reinforcer. We find aversive what we can't control. Giving control weakens the aversive quality of the stimulus. This then opens up occasions for engaging with positive stimuli. The point I'm making here is that the higher intensity of the aversive is not a deal breaker for me as far as acceptability of negative reinforcement goes in the context where our goal is for the aversive to lose its aversiveness. We should always strive to put the animal in a situation where the intensity of the aversive is the lowest possible, but our physical setup might not always allow for low intensity, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't help these animals with a negative reinforcement component. There's the ideal environment, and then there's real life. So the important thing is that the aversive will lose its aversiveness through the training. Medication could help here. It could be a tool to lower the stress level a bit during these difficult conditions. A quieter environment might diminish the aversiveness. An environment without many people moving about might be better. If you can change what you do so that the animal doesn't experience it as being as aversive, do it. To the best of your ability, bring down the stress level. The important aspect here that I want you to realize is that behavior has function. If we don't maintain that function in a situation where the animal is scared of something, I don't think we're as force-free as we could be. We're not as humane as we can be, in my opinion. The animal is asking for distance. It's looking for a way to control their proximity to the scary thing. If we don't give them that, are we the best trainers we could be? When we stick to using food because it makes us feel good to think we are, we're not serving the function of the behavior. That's not to say that you can't feed your dog while moving away from the scary dog in the distance. But the main important reinforcer you want to think about giving is the distance. If you had to choose between the food and the distance, for me, it would have to be the distance, because the animal's body language is telling me that that's the most important reinforcer for them currently. I'm not denying that just using appetitives can sometimes change the animal's response to a formerly aversive stimulus, especially when that stimulus is of low intensity. What I'm saying is that I think we should be mindful of providing negative reinforcement opportunities whenever the animal's body language tells us that it might be important to that animal in that moment, regardless of whether we are adding appetitives to the situations. Again, we want to be as low as possible in intensity so that the animal displays behaviors at the lower hand. A good reason for that is also that we don't want the animal to bite and then have to maintain the function of the biting while we bleed all over. So we want to listen to the animal early on so that the fear and frustration are kept as low as possible, and then the behavior doesn't escalate. Protected contact could be another way to really diminish the stress level. We want to set up the environment so that we don't get the higher intensity behaviors as much as possible, and we want to maintain the function of those lower intensity behaviors that we're going to get. If I think you're about to murder me, I don't want you to try to give me a $1,000 check. Regardless of what your true intentions are, what I perceive you to be is what counts. Keep your money and back off when I ask. If you do back off when I ask, then I might actually be able to change my opinion of you. A cat that hides all day does it because it works for him. It allows him to avoid the scary human, so that's negative reinforcement. It works for the cat. But that's bad for his welfare. Not living 16 hours a day is not good. Going to an adoption trial or foster family sometimes does not solve the problem at all for these cats because hiding works. It allows the cats to avoid the aversive. It's what they've learned to do and it works for them. They have a big behavior history of it working. Empowering them to make the aversive leave gives them new control over their environment, and that's the start of better welfare. By first giving the distance that the animal currently craves, we will then have an animal that craves appetitives. We will go from negative reinforcement to positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is just the first brick that we put on the wall of a relationship that we're building. So ask, what's the strongest reinforcer currently? If it's escape, provide escape. Truly, in any situation where fear is involved, regardless of whether food is an option or not, negative reinforcement being effective is important for welfare. Your animal needs to feel that he can control his aversive. Then he can start to be less afraid of it and start to really enjoy or even just have appetitives. Some instances where a negative reinforcement component is very useful are when food has accidentally been poisoned in a training context. So for example, reverse counter-conditioning was used instead of trace or delay counter-conditioning, and food now predicts scary things are about to happen. Before you can use food again, you can use negative reinforcement to empower the learner to control the aversive. By doing that, you diminish the aversiveness of the aversive and then can start to incorporate food more thoughtfully. Another instance is when an animal doesn't eat or play in the presence of the aversive, whatever its intensity. If the animal does not engage with or consume the item, you can't reinforce behavior or change the emotion with it. For example, with cats that don't play or eat in your presence, you simply do not have appetitives to work with currently. Food has no value right now because of fear. I personally don't want to eat just before going on stage to do a presentation because I'm experiencing stage fright, and that completely abolishes the value of food as an appetitive. It's just not a reinforcer right now. That's what's happening to that cat. If the animal does engage with or consume the item, but his behavior doesn't change, well, reinforcement isn't happening and the emotions aren't changing. Dogs that eat like crocodiles while staring at the trigger are not necessarily looking at the food as a high-value appetitive. It's just stuff that's annoying because it's in their face and it prevents them from watching their trigger, so they eat it to get it out of the way. In other words, by putting food in front of their nose, you're providing a low-intensity aversive that the behavior of eating removes, so negative reinforcement. You'd be much better advised to address the negative reinforcement contingency that the dog is interested in, the one with their trigger, instead of trying to add food to the equation. The second context in which I consider negative reinforcement to be okay to use is when the aversive is of very low intensity, so it does not evoke general avoidance behaviors, The animal is okay with it being applied and only works to escape it. It is followed by positive reinforcement, and the low aversive is faded early in the training and transferred to a cue, just like dancing. So an example of this would be slowly entering the bubble of your animal to initiate a backup, and then reinforcing that with food. Another example would be slowly applying a slight pressure to the leash until the animal shifts his weight and comes towards you, releasing pressure and getting a cookie. Now, we do need to define what is very low intensity here, because it's the element of importance. I do not want to add an aversive that's not already present in my animal's life to get behavior if it's not going to be of a very low intensity. Very low intensity means that the animal will not work to avoid the aversive, only to escape it once it's applied. We shouldn't see general avoidance of the trainer, their hand, the training environment, or anything related to the training setup. We shouldn't see behaviors indicative of appeasement gestures, such as tongue flicks, lowered heads, ears, body, etc. A very low aversive also should not be painful. A pinch or a shock or a slap is high intensity. It's painful. We want to avoid it. A slight hand or leash pressure is probably not painful. We'll work to escape it, but we don't try to constantly avoid the possibility of someone passing by us in the store because we fear their hand on our arm. That being said, we can't be the ones to judge if something is painful or not, or is high intensity or not. We need to rely on the animal's response for that. If the tube where I went down in my example had been just a little narrower, my body would have been more likely to brush up against it as I went down, and that would have made me feel way more trapped and panicking. It's not that it would have been painful, but that touch would have been a higher intensity aversive in this context. So again, we need to look at body language and absence of avoidance behaviors to judge the intensity. The other important aspects are that the negative reinforcement is followed by positive reinforcement, and that the training is quickly transitioned to only positive reinforcement by fading the low aversive prompt early in the training. So the negative reinforcement part is only there to start the behavior, to inspire it, not to maintain it. Just like dancing, it can become a cue. I will add here the following two details. When I talk about assessing the animal's body language, it implies that you're familiar with the species and the individual in front of you. Why? Well, if you aren't used to looking at turtles, you will probably dismiss the fact that they're not moving much as an indicator of stress because you don't expect turtles to move much anyway. That would be a mistake. You need to have experience at reading the species in front of you. Also, the individual in front of you might be one that we would label as more sensitive and likely to react strongly to unexpected things. You won't know that unless you've interacted with them for a little while with appetitives. And it's definitely something you should know beforehand, because then negative reinforcement should not be used to prompt behavior with that individual. Also, on that particular day, that animal that you know well might not be feeling well, have an upset stomach, and you won't know that unless you first interact with them with appetitives. So a likely candidate for this type of negative reinforcement would be one that you have had occasion to work with using positive reinforcement already, that is engaged, interested, enthusiastic in your training, that reliably comes to you for reinforcement, that has a history of touch that is positive, especially if you're going to touch the animal to prompt the behavior. So touch being positive is then really a prerequisite. So that's what I'm implying in saying that the application of this type of negative reinforcement should not evoke avoidance behaviors. After the click, if the animal doesn't enthusiastically come to you for its reinforcer, you know that you need to stop using this technique. If the animal hesitates to come back to you for reinforcement, it means that the aversive was too high in intensity. Try to avoid those instances by observing your animal before choosing to use negative reinforcement in this manner. So if I'm to use labels, I would say that this application of negative reinforcement is mild and temporary, not causing distress. There's no big emotion going on. The side effects are harmless. The application of the aversive is benign, insignificant in terms of fear-inducing, and that it tells the animal what to do for reinforcement efficiently and gets the animal to positive reinforcement faster. If there's another way to get the behavior that's equally efficient and effective without using negative reinforcement, you should generally use that one. Of course, in those two definitions of acceptable uses of negative reinforcement, I'm not addressing aversive things that happen in an emergency to save the animal's life, such as dragging him by the leash if he's gone into the middle of the road, or yelling to prevent him from walking on a hot stove. Vet visits are also a place where some level of restraint might be required in order to obtain tactile information or samples to monitor and or improve the health of the animal. Thankfully, we now have the knowledge and tools to make these instances less stressful for animals. Touch gradient, minimal or no restraint, limited visual stimuli, pre-visit pharmaceuticals that lower the animal's anxiety level, full drive-by sedation, etc. are all things that make the aversive events of the vet visit a lot lower in intensity. I'm hopeful we will continue to gain better knowledge and improve those types of events even more by making them less aversive. Okay, now let's shift gears a little and ponder a bit about terms such as LEMA, force-free, positive, etc. I've seen online discussions where people seem to think that it's okay to move to high-intensity aversives that are not normally present in an animal's life in order to get behavior, because LEMA, or the hierarchy, does not close the door to aversive use in the form of negative reinforcement or positive punishment, for example. Now, if you can't get the behavior you want through management, antecedent arrangement, and positive reinforcement, the solution is not to go straight to a shock collar. If you're not able to limit your use of negative reinforcement to the two instances we've just talked about, it's time to take a step back and think. Sometimes we have to recognize that the animal needs behavioral meds, or is of a species that is not a good fit for our home and lifestyle, because we're asking things of him that don't make sense, considering its ethology and or unique behavioral characteristics. If someone used shock on you, you would call it torture. It wouldn't be good for your welfare, your mental state, or your physical state. It's always hard to recognize that we sometimes don't have the competence to treat a particular case. But before jumping to high-intensity aversives that would be added to and maintained in the animal's life, we need to ask others that have more competence about this issue. Do we need a hierarchy of procedure? Yes, I think so. It helps us to consider the possible solutions in an order that minimizes the risks for the animal, especially with less experienced behavior consultants. Let me give you an example. The cat scratches the sofa. If I'm a normal person, I'll buy double-sided tape and put it on the sofa. I'm not a trainer. I went straight to positive punishment of high intensity. Those paws are going to stick to that tape, the fur is going to get pulled hard, pain is going to be involved. It might solve the problem of the sofa, but we've not addressed the source of the behavior, and it's likely that the cat will find another place to scratch. A competent trainer will explain the ethology of the species and why scratching is an important behavior. Explain where to put scratchers and what are appropriate scratchers. Suggest prompting the behavior with catnip. Use positive reinforcement when the behavior is displayed with good food. And finally, once and only once all these things are in place, will the consultant then suggest putting a shower curtain or a blanket on the sofa. That consultant will not go to positive punishment of high intensity here because he doesn't need to. The shower curtain is most likely extinction. If it's positive punishment, it's of a much less intensity of aversive than the double-sided tape would have been. The hierarchy doesn't mean that we can do anything. It means we need to think about what we're doing before doing it. Here's another example. Let's say that your dog or your cat's paws have long hair that has become matted and he slips and looks painful. We'll train this cooperatively, but in the meantime, his welfare is problematic and we need to shave his underpaws. The default that common people have is to say, restrain him and just get it done. And unfortunately, that's what the veterinary profession used to also accept to do. Now, if we're going through the hierarchy, the first thing that should pop up in your mind should not be heavy restraint, meaning positive punishment for the behavior of wiggling to get away by adding restraint. It should instead be, can we creatively trim the paws by setting up the environment, the antecedents, just right and distracting the animal? For example, can they step up on a very thin mesh and the trimmers or the scissors will be able to do their job well enough under the mesh that we can distract with food? If the animal is nervous for this, can we give short-acting anxiolytics, so change the antecedent, motivating operations? If none of this is possible, again, your reflex should not be to go for every restraint. If quality of life is an issue and trimming the feet is a need, we should go to short sedation to be able to trim the feet while not creating an aversive and problematic situation for the animal in both the short and long term. Using the hierarchy doesn't mean that we never go up. In any case where fear is involved, again, strangers, nail clippers, etc., I think we need to be very mindful of providing negative reinforcement opportunities. In other words, we need to make sure that our animal can escape the aversive should he feel the need to. That's often more important than positive reinforcement for that animal at that moment. But we're not bypassing the hierarchy altogether. That's what the little speed bumps and stop signs are for. We are acknowledging the function of the behavior and addressing it. We stopped and taught at each speed bump and stop sign before progressing up the ladder. And we're also using positive reinforcement for the behaviors that we want if that's available to us. If you only train tricks in highly sociable animals that are never scared of anything, well, maybe then you can not use negative reinforcement. The second you work with fearful animals, reactive animals, husbandry, etc., you need to be aware of what negative reinforcement is and how to use it humanely. So to recap, negative reinforcement is okay in my mind in two situations. Number one is when the aim is to lose the aversiveness of the aversive by giving control to the animal over that aversive, and with using the aversive at as low as possible an intensity. So for strangers, nail clippers, etc. And the second one is to create behavior with very low intensity of aversive, followed by positive reinforcement, with the low aversive being faded early in the training so that we continue only with positive reinforcement, so light pressure to create a sidestep, for example. And you're not going to use this second type of negative reinforcement with a learner that is not already happily engaging with you with positive reinforcement. So we shouldn't see avoidance behaviors being created with this type of negative reinforcement. Let's look at some examples to see if these rules make sense. An example of negative reinforcement that you've probably seen is the one where the parrot learns to step up on a finger by having the person's hand push on their belly. We might say that the bird is flightless and will have to step up on a finger or a stick to be brought back to its cage, so it's an aversive that will have to be present in the animal's life. Okay. Now, do we give the control to make the aversive leave to the bird? No. The finger is presented at full intensity and is not removed at all. If we were to use a fearful or friendly approach instead, we would present the finger at a distance that doesn't evoke all the avoidance behaviors that we saw in that other instance. And we would remove the finger at any calm or inquisitive behavior from the parrot. Over the course of many trials, we would then be able to have our hand near the parrot without him trying to move away from it. Then we can add food to shape the step up, because our hand coming with food is not scary anymore. Just shoving the hand into the parrot's belly does not empower them to make the aversive leave. The aversive is not at its lowest intensity possible in this situation. It evokes avoidance behaviors and is not backed up by positive reinforcement, so it doesn't fall in our acceptable use of negative reinforcement. How about leash pressure during my cat walks when I don't want my cats to go into other people's yards? The cat has just gone to the end of their leash. They applied their weight onto their harness as I just held the leash fixed. I didn't jerk them. We are at the lowest intensity I can currently provide. Moving back towards me releases the pressure and generally makes me provide a treat. We have low intensity and backed up by positive reinforcement. They didn't get the positive reinforcement they were looking for, because we won't go into that neighbor's yard, but they learned that releasing the pressure leads to treats and other exploring opportunities in the back alley. And they aren't avoiding me or the harness afterwards or exhibiting appeasement gestures. I'm also working on getting a stronger recall cue so that I can use that before they get to the end of the leash. So that's an acceptable use of negative reinforcement for me. Now, how about the backing up behavior? That's an interesting one. I actually taught this to my cats using negative reinforcement followed by positive reinforcement before I had the knowledge to realize it. And then I thought, oh, I should feel bad about this, it's negative reinforcement. And I stopped using that cue altogether, thinking I would retrain it with a back feet target, which we've been working on and off. But along the way, I realized that the way I first trained this might not be that bad after all. It was of low intensity and immediately followed by positive reinforcement. My cats didn't start to avoid training sessions or to avoid my feet. And if you've worked with cats, you know they can be very quick at choosing to stop training and move away if you're not fun to be with. What are some of the alternatives out there? Well, one is to put food at the end of a dead-end corridor and then click when the animal backs up after having eaten the treat, capturing the backing up behavior. But why is the animal backing up in the first place? To get out of there. It's no fun being at the end of a dead end where you feel kind of trapped and have no escape route other than backing up. So low intensity aversive is most likely what's happening, negative reinforcement. Your behavior of backing up allows you to escape the enclosed dead end. Now, is it a higher or lower intensity than my slowly walking into my cat's personal space? Good question, because this one is applied by me. I did create a lane when I trained this by bringing my foot forward so that they would tend to back up relatively straight and not turn around. They could choose to jump out of that lane. I also tried training this with the dead-end approach, but then I had to make the lane so narrow and so high for them not to turn around or jump over to get out, that they would actually put 2 paws up front and kick their butt in the air on occasion, or put their 2 front paws up and move on 2 paws to get out. I couldn't get backing up behavior with that dead-end approach. They would enter the dead end for the food, but they would get out of it the quickest way possible, and that wasn't by backing out. I would argue here so that the dead end creates more stress than the human walking up to them in a lane that's not as narrow, where they can also jump to get out. My cats were quick to try to get out of the dead end because it was a very limiting space, and since they are more agile than dogs, getting up on their feet worked quicker than backing up. I'll see how the back feet target goes eventually, but I'm not hitting myself over the head anymore about the way I initially trained backing up. The few times during training that my cats jumped over the object that made up the lane was information to me that I had moved too quickly, too fast. But my cats had more than one way to escape my slowly approaching foot, and that's important. It wasn't just you have to back up, it was you can back up to escape the foot, or you can jump over that thing. More choices are generally a lot better. So this falls under an acceptable use of negative reinforcement. On the feral cat side, or the under-socialized cat side, I still see many discussions where there's this conviction that it takes months to tame fearful cats. That you need to put the cat in a tiny cage and feed him until he likes you, that once you can touch him, he's tame, that you should hang out in the room he's in as much as possible, that he should only have access to food when you're around. All these things are not appropriate, in my opinion. I don't think we need to use these tactics to tame animals, and it shouldn't take months to do it. Angela Renfro proved this with the 5-month-old feral kittens that were set to be euthanized, that she turned around in one session with the Fearful to Friendly protocol and ended up having adopted. Shelters using this protocol have done it with adult cats, as have I. If you work with fearful cats, learn about the cat or Fearful to Friendly protocol and implement it. No one benefits from being in a situation where a cat hides for 3 months, the least of which is that cat, which has terrible welfare. This is the first foster cat I worked with using the Fearful to Friendly approach before our first session and after. She'd been hissing, growling, yelling, and throwing herself at everyone for a full month at the shelter. I gave her control to make me leave. Suddenly, I started to build trust. There's no reason to keep a fearful animal in a stress state for months if you can communicate efficiently to them that you're not a threat by giving them control over making you leave in just one session. So let's stop letting animals live in fear for weeks just because we want to be able to tell ourselves that we're a good person because we use food. Food is not necessarily what's important for that animal. It's not what that animal's behavior is for. Learn how to have this discussion with an animal that builds trust through empowerment. The only reason we still have those comments that it takes months is that people doing this aren't trained, aren't knowledgeable about how to use negative reinforcement, and still have the false idea that food is always good and negative reinforcement is always bad, which is, I hope you've now realized, not true. Negative reinforcement is the goal of the cat's behavior. The cat is behaving to get you to leave. Acknowledge that, give that. Make sure negative reinforcement is in effect when you see that that's what the animal is behaving to achieve. You can use negative reinforcement with the lowest possible intensity of aversive and empower the animal to make the aversive leave, with the goal of the aversive losing its aversiveness. Think about that cat in a cage that got shaped into a calmer hissing behavior, and realize that every time you leave food for a fearful animal, the first thing in their mind is probably that you left. If you just stand there, this food is still secondary. Sure, go give food and leave. Just don't go thinking that the part where you left is not important. In case you haven't realized this is a really big one for me. It really gets my heart pumping to hear all those things people do to cats, while thinking that since they're a good person, anything they'll do will be okay. No one would argue that you shouldn't respond to a stop button by removing the nail clippers, or to a dog growling at your approaching hand by removing your hand. Why then would we argue against giving distance when this is what the animal is asking for? In ABA, they use the acronym EATS to describe the functions of behavior. The functions that behavior can have. So E is escape, A is attention, T is tangible, so food or toy, a tangible object, and S is sensory. So for example, masturbation is reinforced through sensory experiences. If it's escape that's maintaining the behavior, why would we try to use tangibles? We're certainly not going to use attention if the animal is scared of us, but why tangibles? You've probably seen the acronym WTF, what's the function of the behavior. While when we ask what's the function, it's important to listen to the answer and respect it. How about listening to what the learner is saying and backing off when they ask? Only then can we really be polite, respectful, and deserving of trust. The scary thing isn't as scary when it listens to us. By giving escape, we make escape less valued, and then the tangibles value goes up, and we can start using them more efficiently. And when we address the function of the behavior, we can then move on to other things. By giving control to make us leave, we suddenly give access to a whole broader set of appetitives. So the CAT protocol or F2F protocol definitely falls under the category of appropriate use of negative reinforcement. The aversive is as low as possible. The goal is to lose the aversiveness by giving control. We want empowered learners. That means that we want learners that have behaviors that allow them to gain appetitives, but also that allow them to avoid or escape aversives. I think it's time we started focusing on negative reinforcement a little more, identifying moments where that's what's more important to that animal. We've done a great job moving to force-free, more positive reinforcement-based training. It's time we stopped assigning good and bad tags to principles and looked at what's happening in that moment. I hope you can join me on that journey. That's the kind of negative reinforcement I want to see talked about more. Let's stop being afraid of words. I'm hopeful we can move forward, and instead of having that bad gut reaction when we hear the word negative reinforcement, we can start to have a neutral gut reaction, being rational and interested human beings, and ask, what does that negative reinforcement look like? Describe what you mean for me. Instead of being judgmental, let's be curious. Now I do need to add an addendum to my 2 acceptable uses of negative reinforcement. You don't want your default way of training to be to go straight to negative reinforcement. Okay, that's especially for the second acceptable use. If you're a beginner trainer, you're currently setting up your training framework in your head. All you do from now on will build on this. So you want to become fluent at creatively finding ways to train using positive reinforcement now. We repeat what we have rehearsed. So don't start by rehearsing negative reinforcement, because you're not going to be able to creatively find out quickly what would work with positive reinforcement. Don't make it your default. It will be a lot more work to become a good creative positive reinforcement trainer if you initially go to negative reinforcement all the time. That's where the hierarchy is important. If you have an animal that naturally backs up all the time, your default way of thinking should be to capture it, not to negatively reinforce it. That's the reflex I want you to have. You don't want to train in a way that gets you stop buttons all the time. You want to become good at arranging the environment of the training session and providing positive reinforcement so that you get very few stop buttons. Acknowledge the animal's no, and then do better on the next trial. Don't rely on the no's as a default. The other important thing in this addendum is something that I've already mentioned, which is that we should always make sure that the ratio of appetitives to aversives is as high as can be in our learner's life. So life is not worth much when we can control our aversives, but we don't have many appetitives we can gain. Let's all make sure that we provide many opportunities to gain appetitives in our animals' lives, of great variety, so food, treats, fresh air, perching, smelling, playing, running, social interactions, you name it, or better yet, let your animal name it. I concentrated on negative reinforcement in this presentation because it's the subject that I wanted you to understand better, but it's pivotal to provide a high ratio of appetitives to aversives, of positive reinforcement to negative reinforcement, in your animals' lives to provide a life worth living. In order to do that, we need to focus on the good things and also be mindful of reducing exposure to natural aversives in the environment as much as possible. That's when we'll get a good ratio. I'll illustrate this with a video that also speaks to having choices. So recently I was in a job where I had to go down inside a wastewater pumping station. No one finds that very appetitive. It smells like poop. The floor you're standing on above the water level is full of holes and poop. It's dangerous, it's a small space, it's underground, it's only accessible via ladder. Did I mention it's wastewater? It's an aversive space. Now, bummer, outside it was well below freezing, with snow everywhere, and on that day it was incredibly windy, and we were right next to the ocean, which only made it worse. Everyone was freezing their ass off outside, and the skin on your face was literally burning in the freezing wind. It was a very aversive weather to be in. So I had to choose between the aversive, underground, smelly, poopy space and the aversive, incredibly cold weather outside. I chose the poopy space most of the time. It allowed me to avoid the terrible cold. Both these places were aversive, however, but to varying degrees. Back at the motel, we were much happier. The motel is a warm, dry, and comfortable space. It's an appetitive. Thankfully, that day, I had behavior that allowed me to control the cold, meaning I could go to the poopy space. But I also had that appetitive motel room to retreat to afterwards. I didn't need to spend my day only being able to choose between two aversive spaces, the poop or the cold. Make sure that you and your animals have a lot of appetitives in life. A lot of warm, dry, and welcoming motel rooms. Having choices and a sense of control isn't enough. A high ratio of appetitives to aversives is important. I hope this presentation has helped you to think about negative reinforcement in all its shapes and sizes. As a trainer, I struggle at times, but I strive to constantly do better. I hope this presentation helps you to do better too with the animals you work with.